The ocean keeps its secrets well, but some truths are too powerful to stay buried beneath the waves. What happens when the very people who swore to protect and serve become the monsters in the dark? When corruption runs so deep that justice seems impossible, and when a young woman's fight for truth leads her to the bottom of the sea with chains around her ankles. This is the story of Detective Sarah Chun, a Marine Corps veteran turned police officer who discovered that some battles don't end when you leave the battlefield. Some wars follow you home, and some enemies wear badges instead of uniforms. They thought the ocean would silence her forever. They thought wrong. Because Marines are taught to adapt, overcome, and survive, even when survival seems impossible. Even when breathing underwater becomes a matter of life, death, and justice. What you're about to read isn't just a story of survival. It's a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to let corruption win, no matter how deep they're buried, no matter how impossible the odds seem. The truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest, darkest places. Detective Sarah Chun pressed her face against the cold window of the police cruiser, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears on a grieving face. The city looked different at 3 in the morning, stripped of its daytime pretenses, revealing the raw truth that most people preferred to ignore. Street lights cast long shadows that seemed to hide more than they illuminated, and the empty roads stretched ahead like questions without answers. Her partner, Detective Marcus Rodriguez, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as they approached the warehouse district. The radio crackled with routine calls, but tonight felt anything but routine. They had been investigating a series of disappearances that the department seemed eager to classify as runaways or voluntary missing persons. Sarah knew better. 8 years in the Marines had taught her to recognize patterns that others missed, to see the connections that weren't obvious on the surface. The first case had crossed their desk 6 months ago. Jennifer Walsh, 19 years old, had vanished after leaving her job at a downtown restaurant. Her manager claimed she had quit without notice, but her roommate insisted Jennifer would never leave without her belongings or her cat. The official report listed her as a voluntary missing person after a cursory investigation that lasted all of 3 days. Then came Maria Santos, 22, who disappeared from a bus stop near her college campus. The cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that night, and the security guard claimed he saw nothing unusual. Again, the case was quickly filed away as another young woman who probably ran off with a boyfriend. Sarah had requested to dig deeper into both cases, but her supervisor, Captain James Morrison, had been reluctant to authorize additional resources. Budget constraints, he said. More pressing cases demanding attention. But Sarah recognized the pattern that was emerging, and it made her stomach turn. Both women had one thing in common beyond their age and sudden disappearance. They had both filed complaints against police officers in the months before they vanished. Jennifer had reported being harassed by an off-duty cop at the restaurant where she worked. Maria had been pulled over for speeding and claimed the officer had made inappropriate advances before letting her go with a warning. As they pulled into the warehouse district, Marcus broke the silence that had settled between them. He was a good cop, honest and dedicated, but he had been with the department for 15 years and understood the unwritten rules about not rocking the boat too hard. Sarah respected him, but she also knew he preferred to work within the system rather than challenge it directly. The call had come in an hour earlier. A security guard doing his rounds had discovered what appeared to be evidence of a struggle in an abandoned warehouse. Blood on the concrete floor, personal belongings scattered around, and signs that someone had been dragged toward the loading dock that faced the harbor. The guard had immediately called it in, and somehow the case had been assigned to Sarah and Marcus. The warehouse stood like a monument to industrial decay, its broken windows staring out at the water like empty eye sockets. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter as they approached the entrance, the familiar weight of her service weapon a comfort against her ribs. The security guard, a nervous man in his 60s named Tom Fletcher, was waiting for them near the main entrance. Fletcher led them through the maze of empty corridors and abandoned office spaces, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of them like a ghost. The building smelled of rust, mold, and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify, but that made her marine instincts scream warnings. They had been in places like this in Afghanistan, buildings where bad things had happened, and the walls seemed to absorb the violence. The main warehouse space opened up before them like a cathedral of shadows. Fletcher's light swept across the concrete floor, revealing the dark stains that had prompted his call to the police. Sarah knelt beside the largest stain, noting the spatter pattern and the way it seemed to lead toward the back of the warehouse. Marcus began photographing the scene while she examined the personal belongings scattered nearby. A woman's purse, its contents spilled across the dirty concrete. Lipstick, keys, a wallet containing the driver's license of Amanda Torres, 21 years old. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized they were looking at what might be their third victim. Amanda's photo showed a smiling young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, the kind of person who probably trusted too easily and believed that good people would protect her from the bad ones. As they worked the scene, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The drag marks leading toward the loading dock were too neat, too deliberate. Someone had tried to make it look like a struggle, but the pattern was wrong. In her experience, real violence was chaotic, unpredictable. This looked staged, as if someone wanted the scene to tell a specific story. Marcus was examining the loading dock when he called her over. The large doors had been opened recently, despite the building being officially abandoned for over 2 years. Beyond the dock, the dark water of the harbor stretched out toward the industrial section of the port. It would be the perfect place to dispose of evidence, or worse. Sarah studied the water, calculating distances and depths. The harbor was deep here, with strong currents that could carry things far out to sea. If someone wanted to make evidence disappear permanently, this would be an ideal location. The thought made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and determination. As they finished processing the scene, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows of the warehouse or observing them from one of the other buildings in the district. Marcus seemed to sense her unease, but didn't comment on it directly. Back at the station, they began the process of tracking down Amanda Torres and determining when she had last been seen. The trail led them through a series of dead ends and reluctant witnesses. Amanda had been working as a waitress at a club downtown, the kind of place that stayed open late and attracted customers who preferred to conduct their business away from prying eyes. The club manager, a thin man with nervous eyes named Danny Walsh, claimed Amanda had simply stopped showing up for work about a week ago. He had no forwarding address, no emergency contact information, and seemed eager to end the conversation as quickly as possible. When Sarah pressed him for details about Amanda's last shift, he became defensive and suggested they talk to his lawyer if they had more questions. Sarah left the club with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that they were dealing with something much bigger than random disappearances. The pattern was becoming clearer, and it painted a picture that made her wish she was wrong. Young women who had somehow crossed paths with law enforcement were vanishing without a trace, leaving behind carefully staged crime scenes that suggested violence, but provided no real leads. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the files for all 3 cases. She had spread photographs, reports, and notes across her kitchen table, looking for connections that the official investigations had missed. Her military training had taught her to approach problems systematically, to look for patterns and weaknesses that could be exploited. What she found made her blood run cold. All 3 women had not only encountered police officers before their disappearances, but they had all made informal complaints that were never officially recorded. Jennifer had told friends about the harassment at her workplace. Maria had confided in her roommate about the traffic stop that made her uncomfortable. And, according to her coworkers at the club, Amanda had mentioned being followed by what she thought might be an unmarked police car in the days before she vanished. Sarah reached for her phone to call Marcus, then hesitated. Something about the way their cases had been assigned nagged at her. 3 separate disappearances, all coincidentally given to the same detective team. Captain Morrison had claimed it was about efficiency, keeping related cases with investigators who were already familiar with the pattern. But what if it wasn't coincidence at all? The thought that someone within the department might be involved in the disappearances was almost too terrible to consider. Sarah had served her country with honor, had trusted her fellow Marines with her life, and had joined the police force because she believed in justice and protecting the innocent. The idea that the very institution she had sworn to serve might be corrupt at its core challenged everything she believed about right and wrong. But, as she stared at the photographs of three smiling young women who might never come home, Sarah knew she couldn't ignore the evidence just because it led to uncomfortable conclusions. She had taken an oath to protect and serve, and that oath didn't come with exceptions for politically sensitive investigations or departmentally inconvenient truths. Over the next several days, Sarah began conducting her own quiet investigation parallel to the official case work. She used her lunch breaks and off-duty time to retrace the steps of all three victims, interviewing friends and co-workers who might have been overlooked in the initial investigations. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. Jennifer Walsh had been planning to file a formal complaint against Officer Kevin Brennan for sexual harassment. She had confided to a friend that she had evidence, photographs from the restaurant's security camera showing Brennan cornering her in the storage room. The complaint was never filed, and the security footage had mysteriously disappeared from the restaurant system. Maria Santos had actually begun the process of filing a complaint against Officer Thomas Hart for inappropriate conduct during a traffic stop. She had contacted a lawyer and was scheduled to meet with Internal Affairs the week after she disappeared. The lawyer had assumed she had changed her mind about pursuing the matter when she failed to show up for the appointment. Amanda Torres had been the most bold of the three. According to her closest friend at the club, Amanda had been gathering evidence about police corruption for months. She claimed to have witnessed officers accepting bribes from club owners and had been secretly recording conversations on her phone. She had planned to take her information to the FBI, convinced that local law enforcement couldn't be trusted. The picture was becoming crystal clear, and it terrified Sarah more than anything she had faced during her deployments overseas. At least in Afghanistan, she had known who the enemy was. Here, the enemy wore the same uniform she did and hid behind the same badge that was supposed to represent justice and protection. Sarah realized she was walking into a war zone where the rules of engagement were unclear and the enemy had all the advantages. They controlled the evidence, the investigations, and the narrative. They had the power to make people disappear and to ensure that those disappearances were never properly investigated. As she sat in her car outside the police station, watching her colleagues come and go, Sarah wondered how many of them were involved in whatever conspiracy had claimed these three women. How many good cops were unknowingly protecting bad ones? How many were actively participating in the cover-up? The weight of her Marine training settled around her like familiar armor. She had been in impossible situations before, had faced enemies who seemed to hold all the cards. But she had never backed down from a fight, especially when innocent lives hung in the balance. The question wasn't whether she would investigate further. The question was how to do it without becoming the fourth victim. That night, Sarah made copies of everything she had discovered and stored them in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. She wrote a detailed letter explaining her investigation and her suspicions, sealed it in an envelope, and left instructions with her bank that it should be opened if anything happened to her. If they wanted to silence her the same way they had silenced Jennifer, Maria, and Amanda, at least the truth would have a chance to survive. Sarah Chin sat in her unmarked car across the street from Officer Kevin Brennan's apartment complex, watching the windows of his second-floor unit through a pair of binoculars. It was her third night of surveillance, and she was beginning to understand the patterns of his life outside the precinct. Brennan worked the evening shift, which meant he usually arrived home around 2 in the morning and left again around noon. He lived alone, rarely had visitors, and seemed to spend most of his free time at a bar called Murphy's that catered to off-duty cops. The more Sarah learned about the three officers who had encountered her missing victims, the more convinced she became that their disappearances weren't random. Brennan, Hart, and Detective Ray Sullivan, who had handled Amanda Torres's initial missing person report, all had histories of complaints that had been quietly swept under the rug. None of the complaints had resulted in disciplinary action, and all of them involved interactions with young women. Sarah's unofficial investigation had revealed a pattern of behavior that made her skin crawl. Brennan had been accused of sexual harassment by multiple women over his 8-year career, but the complaints had always been dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. Hart had been involved in several traffic stops that resulted in allegations of inappropriate conduct, but his supervisors had consistently backed his version of events. Sullivan had been accused of mishandling domestic violence cases, particularly those involving young female victims who later recanted their statements under suspicious circumstances. The connection between these three officers and the missing women couldn't be coincidence. Sarah was certain they were involved in a conspiracy that went beyond individual corruption. The question was how high up the chain of command it extended and how she could gather enough evidence to expose it without ending up like Jennifer, Maria, and Amanda. As she watched Brennan's apartment, Sarah's radio crackled with a call that made her blood freeze. Another young woman had been reported missing. Lisa Park, 23 years old, had failed to return home from her job at a coffee shop near the university. Her roommate had called the police after Lisa didn't come home and couldn't be reached on her phone. Sarah listened to the details being broadcast and felt a familiar chill of recognition. Lisa worked near the police academy, where she would have regular contact with officers. Her roommate mentioned that Lisa had been upset about something involving a cop who had been bothering her at work. The pattern was repeating itself, and Sarah realized she might be looking at the beginning of another disappearance rather than the aftermath. Without hesitation, Sarah started her car and drove toward the coffee shop where Lisa worked. If she could get there before the official investigation began, she might be able to gather information that would otherwise be overlooked or suppressed. Her heart pounded as she weaved through the late-night traffic, knowing that time was running out for another innocent young woman. The coffee shop was located in a strip mall that served the university community. It stayed open until midnight to catch the late-night study crowd, and Lisa had been working the closing shift when she vanished. Sarah arrived to find the shop dark and empty, with Lisa's car still parked in the back lot where she had left it before her shift began. Sarah examined the vehicle carefully, noting that Lisa's purse and phone were missing, but her car keys had been left on the driver's seat. The doors were unlocked, and there were no signs of a struggle in or around the car. It looked as though Lisa had been approached while walking to her vehicle and had either gone willingly with someone she trusted or had been taken quickly and efficiently by someone with experience. The manager of the coffee shop, a college student named Jake Morrison, arrived while Sarah was examining the scene. He was Captain Morrison's nephew, and Sarah felt her suspicions sharpen as she realized the connection. Jake explained that Lisa had seemed nervous during her shift, constantly checking the windows and jumping at sudden noises. She had mentioned being followed by a police car on her way to work for the past several days. Sarah questioned Jake carefully, trying to determine what he knew and whether his family connection to the police captain was relevant to Lisa's disappearance. Jake seemed genuinely concerned about Lisa and provided details that painted a picture of a young woman who had been increasingly frightened in the days before she vanished. According to Jake, Lisa had been complaining about a police officer who had been coming into the coffee shop and making her uncomfortable. The officer would sit at a table where he could watch her work and would try to engage her in personal conversations when other customers weren't around. Lisa had asked Jake not to schedule her for shifts when the officer usually came in, but their staffing was too limited to accommodate her request. Sarah asked Jake to describe the officer, and his description matched Detective Ray Sullivan perfectly. Sullivan was one of the three officers connected to her previous missing persons cases, and now he appeared to be stalking Lisa in the days before her disappearance. The pattern was becoming undeniable, and Sarah realized she was looking at the work of a coordinated group rather than individual predators. As Sarah drove back toward the police station to file her report on Lisa's disappearance, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going directly to Captain Morrison with her findings, she decided to conduct her own search for Lisa before the official investigation could be compromised or misdirected. Sarah had learned enough about the pattern to make an educated guess about where Lisa might be taken. The warehouse district where they had found evidence of Amanda Torres's struggle was part of a larger industrial area that included several abandoned buildings and isolated locations perfect for holding someone against their will. If the same group was responsible for all four disappearances, they might be using a consistent location for whatever they were doing to these women. She spent the rest of the night driving through the industrial district, looking for any signs of recent activity in buildings that should have been empty. Her marine training kicked in as she approached each location, using cover and concealment to observe without being detected. Most of the buildings were genuinely abandoned, showing no signs of recent use or occupancy. But as dawn began to break over the harbor, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. An old fish processing plant near the water's edge showed signs of recent activity despite being officially closed for over a year. Fresh tire tracks led to a loading dock, and she could see that some of the windows had been covered from the inside with what looked like plastic sheeting. Sarah parked several blocks away and approached the building on foot, using the early morning shadows for concealment. Her service weapon felt reassuring against her ribs as she circled the building, looking for the best vantage point to observe without exposing herself. The facility was larger than it had appeared from the road, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways and loading areas. As she watched from behind a rusted shipping container, Sarah saw a black sedan pull into the loading area. Her breath caught as she recognized Detective Ray Sullivan behind the wheel. He was followed by a second vehicle, an unmarked police cruiser that she knew belonged to Officer Thomas Hart. Both men got out of their vehicles and approached the main building as if they belonged there. Sarah realized she had found the location where the missing women were being taken and possibly where they were being held. The question was whether Lisa Park was inside that building and whether she was still alive. Sarah's military training told her to call for backup and approach the situation with overwhelming force. But her investigation had taught her that she couldn't trust her fellow officers, and calling for backup might alert the very people who were involved in the conspiracy. She made the difficult decision to observe and gather evidence rather than attempt an immediate rescue. If she moved too quickly without proof of what was happening inside the building, Sullivan and Hart could claim they were conducting legitimate police business. She needed evidence that would be impossible to explain away or suppress. Sarah positioned herself where she could watch the main entrance and began photographing everything she saw. Over the next several hours, she documented a pattern of activity that convinced her she had found the center of the conspiracy. Officers arrived and left at regular intervals, staying inside the building for anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. She recognized some of the faces from the precinct, including Captain Morrison himself, who arrived in an unmarked car around noon and spent over 2 hours inside the facility. The sight of her commanding officer participating in whatever was happening inside that building was like a physical blow. Sarah realized the corruption went all the way to the top of her department and possibly beyond. As the day wore on, Sarah began to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just a group of rogue officers preying on vulnerable women. This was an organized criminal enterprise operating under the protection of police badges and using official resources to cover their tracks. The missing women weren't random victims. They were specific targets who had threatened to expose the corruption. Sarah's heart broke as she realized that Jennifer, Maria, and Amanda had probably been brought to this same facility before their final fate was sealed. They had fought for justice and been silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Now Lisa Park was inside that building, probably experiencing the same terror and helplessness that had claimed the others. As evening approached, Sarah knew she had to make a choice. She could continue gathering evidence and hope to build a case strong enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, or she could attempt to rescue Lisa while she might still be alive. The smart play was to be patient, to document everything, and find a way to contact federal authorities who could investigate without local interference. But Sarah's conscience wouldn't let her abandon Lisa the same way the system had abandoned the others. She had joined the police force to protect people, and that mission didn't come with exceptions for politically complicated situations. Lisa was in that building because she had been brave enough to stand up to corruption, and she deserved someone to be equally brave in standing up for her. Sarah waited until after dark to make her move. The activity at the facility had died down, with only 2 vehicles remaining in the parking area. She approached the building using techniques she had learned in urban warfare training, moving from cover to cover and staying in the shadows where the security lighting couldn't reach her. The building was larger up close than it had appeared from her observation point. Multiple entrances, numerous windows, and several levels meant that finding Lisa would be like searching a maze while avoiding detection by armed and dangerous men. Sarah forced herself to think methodically, using her training to develop a plan that maximized her chances of success. She found an unlocked service entrance on the side of the building that appeared to be unwatched. The door opened into a corridor that smelled of fish, mold, and something else that made her stomach turn. Sarah moved carefully through the building, her weapon drawn, and her senses on high alert for any sign of danger. The main processing floor was a maze of abandoned equipment and makeshift offices. Sarah could hear voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building, but she couldn't make out the words or determine how many people were present. She followed the sound through a series of corridors, each step taking her further from her escape route and deeper into enemy territory. When she finally found the source of the voices, Sarah felt her blood run cold. Through a partially open door, she could see into a room where several men were seated around a table covered with money, drugs, and what appeared to be identification documents. She recognized Sullivan, Hart, and two other officers from her precinct, along with several men in civilian clothes who had the bearing of career criminals. Sarah Chun crouched in the shadows outside the room where Lisa Park was being held, her heart hammering against her ribs as she calculated angles, distances, and her chances of survival. 6 armed men, at least 4 of whom were trained police officers, stood between her and the terrified young woman whose only crime had been refusing to be intimidated by corrupt cops. Through the partially open door, Sarah could hear Detective Sullivan's voice rising above the others as he outlined their plans for Lisa. The conversation made her stomach turn with its casual discussion of human lives as commodities to be disposed of when they became inconvenient. These weren't officers who had crossed the line in a moment of weakness. They were career criminals who had systematically infiltrated law enforcement to protect their operations. Sarah forced herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. The room had only one entrance that she could see, which meant her approach would be predictable. But it also meant that once she engaged, the suspects would have limited escape routes. Her military training had taught her to turn disadvantages into advantages, to find ways to make superior numbers work against her enemies rather than for them. She studied the layout of the abandoned processing facility, noting the positions of machinery that could provide cover and the locations of windows that might offer alternative escape routes. The building's age worked in her favor. Its industrial construction meant solid walls that could stop bullets, and its deteriorated state meant plenty of debris that could be used for concealment or distraction. As Sarah prepared to make her move, she heard footsteps approaching from deeper in the building. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the voice of Captain Morrison talking to someone on his radio. Her commanding officer was coordinating with someone outside the building, possibly arranging for additional personnel or preparing for Lisa's transportation to another location. The arrival of Captain Morrison changed everything. Sarah now faced 7 adversaries instead of 6, and their leader was someone who knew her capabilities and limitations intimately. Morrison had read her personnel file, knew about her military background, and would be prepared for the kind of tactics she might employ. The element of surprise was her only advantage, and she was about to lose that as well. Morrison entered the room where Lisa was being held, and Sarah could hear him greeting the others with the casual familiarity of long-term partners in crime. He asked about the timeline for moving their prisoner, and Sullivan responded that they were waiting for confirmation from their contacts about the pickup location. Lisa would be transported within the hour to a cargo ship waiting in international waters, where she would disappear forever. Sarah realized she was out of time. If she waited any longer, Lisa would be moved to a location where rescue would be impossible. But attempting to take on 7 armed men in a direct confrontation was suicide, no matter how good her training had been. She needed to find a way to even the odds before making her move. The old fish processing plant still had its industrial electrical system partially intact, and Sarah remembered seeing a main power panel near the entrance where she had come in. If she could cut the power to the building, she could use the darkness and confusion to her advantage. The suspects would be temporarily blinded and disoriented, giving her precious seconds to act before they could adapt to the new situation. Sarah made her way back through the building toward the electrical panel, moving as quietly as possible through the maze of abandoned equipment and debris-filled corridors. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and Every sound she made seemed impossibly loud in the industrial silence. Her service weapon felt inadequate for what she was about to attempt, but it was all she had. The electrical panel was located in a utility room near the main entrance, exactly where she had remembered seeing it. The system was old but functional, with clearly labeled breakers that controlled different sections of the building. Sarah studied the layout for a moment, identifying which breakers would cut power to the room where Lisa was being held while leaving some emergency lighting in other areas that might aid her escape. As she reached for the main breaker, Sarah heard her radio crackle with an incoming transmission. The sound made her freeze, realizing that her radio traffic could be monitored by the very people she was trying to surprise. Morrison and his accomplices would be listening to police communications, and any backup requests or status updates could alert them to her presence. Sarah turned off her radio and removed the battery, ensuring that her position couldn't be tracked or her communications intercepted. She was now completely cut off from any possibility of backup, but she was also free to operate without fear of electronic surveillance. In Afghanistan, she had learned that sometimes the most dangerous missions required complete radio silence and total reliance on individual initiative. With the radio disabled, Sarah threw the main breaker and plunged the building into darkness. The sudden absence of electrical humming and ventilation noise was replaced by shouts of confusion and anger from the room where the criminals had been meeting. She heard chairs scraping against the floor and the metallic sounds of weapons being drawn as the men prepared to defend themselves against an unknown threat. Sarah moved through the darkened building with the confidence of someone who had spent months fighting in urban environments where electrical power was sporadic at best. Her eyes adjusted quickly to the available light from windows and emergency exits, and her memory of the building's layout guided her back toward the room where Lisa was being held. The suspects were using flashlights and cell phone lights to illuminate their immediate area, but the beams created more shadows than they eliminated and provided perfect targets for anyone attacking from darkness. Sarah could hear Morrison's voice trying to organize a systematic search of the building, but the confusion and limited visibility were working against their numerical advantage. As she approached the room, Sarah could see that someone had moved Lisa to what they thought was a more secure position behind an overturned table. The young woman was still bound and gagged, but her eyes were wide with hope as she realized that someone was attempting a rescue. Sarah caught Lisa's attention and held a finger to her lips, signaling for silence while she dealt with the armed men between them. Detective Sullivan was positioned near the doorway with his weapon drawn, scanning the corridor beyond for signs of movement. His flashlight beam swept back and forth in a predictable pattern that revealed his location while temporarily destroying his night vision each time he looked directly into the light. Sarah waited for the right moment, when his attention was focused in the opposite direction, before making her move. Her approach was silent and swift, learned through countless hours of close-quarters combat training and refined through real-world experience in hostile territory. Sullivan never knew she was there until she struck him with the butt of her pistol, dropping him unconscious to the floor without firing a shot. His weapon and flashlight scattered across the concrete, creating additional noise and confusion. The sound of Sullivan's collapse alerted the others to Sarah's presence, but they couldn't pinpoint her location in the darkness. Officer Hart moved toward the doorway to check on his partner, making himself a perfect target silhouetted against the ambient light from the windows behind him. Sarah's military training took over, and she fired twice center mass, dropping Hart before he could call out a warning to the others. The gunfire erupted into chaos as the remaining suspects opened fire in her general direction, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions while they destroyed their own night vision. Sarah rolled behind a piece of abandoned machinery and returned fire, picking her shots carefully to conserve ammunition and maximize effectiveness. Each shot was aimed and deliberate, the result of thousands of hours of training and real combat experience. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the noise as he tried to coordinate the response to Sarah's attack. He had recognized her shooting pattern and was shouting orders based on his knowledge of her capabilities. But his familiarity with Sarah's training worked both ways. She knew how he thought tactically and could anticipate his attempts to outmaneuver her. As the firefight continued, Sarah worked her way around the perimeter of the room using cover and concealment to avoid the increasingly desperate fire from the remaining suspects. She could hear ammunition running low as their initial panic gave way to more disciplined fire control, but their position was untenable as long as she could maintain mobility in the darkness. One of the civilian criminals made the mistake of trying to flank her position, moving away from the group in an attempt to get an angle on her location. Sarah was waiting for him, having anticipated the maneuver based on his previous movements. Her shot took him down cleanly, and his flashlight went spinning across the floor before shattering against a concrete pillar. The psychological impact of losing 3 men in rapid succession was beginning to show in the voices and movements of the survivors. Morrison was still trying to maintain command and control, but his orders were becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that his numerical advantage was being systematically eliminated by someone who knew how to fight in these conditions. Sarah used the growing desperation to her advantage, employing tactics designed to increase psychological pressure while conserving her ammunition for the final confrontation. She moved between positions regularly, creating the impression that she was everywhere at once. She used noise discipline to mask her movements while creating diversions that drew fire away from her actual location. The final assault came with the desperation of cornered animals. Captain Morrison's voice echoed through the darkened fish processing plant as he coordinated the last desperate charge against Sarah's position. She could hear the remaining 3 men moving through the debris and machinery, their flashlight beams creating wild patterns of light and shadow as they tried to surround her. Sarah had positioned herself behind a massive industrial freezer unit that provided solid cover from multiple angles while allowing her to monitor the approaches to Lisa's location. Her ammunition was running dangerously low, with only 8 rounds remaining in her service weapon and no spare magazines. Each shot would have to count, because once her ammunition was gone, she would have to rely on hand-to-hand combat skills against armed opponents. The first man to reach her position was one of the civilian criminals, a heavy-set man with gang tattoos covering his arms and neck. He approached from her left flank, using the shadows between machinery to mask his movement until he was almost close enough to touch her. Sarah waited until he committed to his final rush before rising from cover and putting 2 rounds center mass. He went down hard, his weapon clattering away into the darkness. Morrison's voice was getting closer, and Sarah could tell he was coordinating with the remaining suspect to catch her in a crossfire. Her old commanding officer knew her capabilities better than anyone else in that building, and he was using that knowledge to predict her likely responses to their tactical situation. But Sarah had learned things about urban combat during her deployments that weren't covered in police academy training, and those lessons were about to prove decisive. Instead of waiting for the attack to develop, Sarah went on the offensive. She moved quickly through the shadows toward Morrison's voice, using techniques she had learned in house-to-house fighting in Afghanistan. The key was to disrupt their coordination by attacking before they could execute their plan, forcing them to react to her movements instead of implementing their own strategy. She found Morrison crouched behind a control panel about 30 feet from where Lisa was being held. The captain had his radio in one hand and his service weapon in the other, and he was speaking in quiet tones to the remaining suspect about timing their final assault. Sarah could see that he was wearing body armor under his civilian clothes, which meant she would have to aim for his head or legs to stop him effectively. Morrison sensed her presence just before she fired, and his years of experience saved his life as he dove to one side. Sarah's shot sparked off the metal housing of the control panel where his head had been a split second earlier. Morrison rolled behind additional cover and returned fire, his shots coming dangerously close to Sarah's position as she moved to avoid his counterattack. The remaining civilian criminal used the distraction of the firefight to advance on Lisa's position, apparently intending to use the young woman as a human shield to force Sarah to surrender. Sarah saw his movement in her peripheral vision and realized that her tactical situation had just become impossible. She couldn't engage Morrison effectively while the other man threatened Lisa, but she couldn't protect Lisa while Morrison had her pinned down with accurate fire. Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had ever learned. She broke cover and ran directly toward Lisa's position, drawing fire from both remaining suspects while exposing herself to deadly crossfire. Bullets whined past her ears and sparked off the concrete floor as she sprinted through the maze of abandoned equipment, relying on speed and unpredictability to keep her alive. The criminal reaching for Lisa never expected Sarah's suicidal charge, and his surprise cost him his life. Sarah's shot took him in the chest at point-blank range, dropping him on top of the overturned table where Lisa was hidden. The young woman's muffled scream was lost in the noise of gunfire as Sarah dove behind cover just as Morrison's next shots shattered the air where she had been standing. With only 4 rounds remaining and Morrison still armed and dangerous, Sarah found herself in an impossible tactical situation. Her commanding officer had better cover, more ammunition, and the tactical patience to wait for her to make a mistake. He also had backup on the way. Sarah could hear vehicles approaching the building as Morrison's radio crackled with status reports from other corrupt officers responding to assist. Sarah realized that her only chance of getting Lisa out alive was to end the confrontation with Morrison quickly before reinforcements arrived to tip the balance decisively against her. She had learned in combat that sometimes the most dangerous tactical decision was also the only one that offered any chance of success. Everything she had accomplished would be meaningless if Lisa died, because Sarah wasn't brave enough to take the ultimate risk. She removed her badge and service weapon belt, leaving them behind cover where Morrison could see them if he advanced on her position. Then, she drew her backup weapon, a small pistol she carried in an ankle holster that Morrison wouldn't know about. If he thought she had surrendered, he might expose himself long enough for her to take the shot that would end this nightmare. Morrison's voice called out across the room, offering her a chance to surrender in exchange for Lisa's safety. His tone was reasonable and professional, the same voice he had used during briefings and performance evaluations. It was disturbing to hear that familiar authority attempting to negotiate her surrender while surrounded by the bodies of the men he had led into corruption and violence. Sarah called back that she was out of ammunition and willing to discuss terms, while quietly working her way to a position where she could see Morrison's location. She needed him to believe that he had won, that she was defeated and ready to give up. Her life depended on selling that performance convincingly while positioning herself for one final, desperate gambit. Morrison stepped out from behind his cover, his weapon trained on the area where Sarah's voice had come from. His body armor and tactical positioning showed that he wasn't taking any chances, but his confidence in having cornered her was evident in his movement and posture. He had served with Sarah for over 2 years and believed he understood her capabilities and limitations completely. Sarah's shot took Morrison in the leg, below the protection of his body armor and above his tactical boot. The small caliber round wasn't immediately fatal, but it sent him crashing to the ground and caused him to drop his weapon as he tried to apply pressure to the wound. Sarah emerged from cover with her backup weapon trained on him, finally holding the tactical advantage she needed. But Morrison wasn't finished fighting. As Sarah approached to secure his weapon, he pulled a knife from his belt and lunged at her with the desperate strength of someone who knew his life was over either way. The blade caught Sarah across the ribs, slicing through her jacket and drawing blood before she could step back far enough to avoid the attack. The knife wound burned like fire, but Sarah's training took over, and she put 2 more rounds into Morrison's chest before he could follow up his attack. Her former commanding officer collapsed backward against the control panel, his eyes already glazing over as his life leaked out onto the concrete floor. Sarah stood over Morrison's body for a moment, trying to process the fact that she had killed her own captain in a gunfight inside an abandoned building. The moral complexity of what had just happened would have to be dealt with later. Right now, she could hear vehicles outside and knew that Morrison's backup was about to arrive. She rushed to Lisa's position and began cutting the duct tape that bound her hands and covered her mouth. The young woman was in shock, trembling, and barely responsive to Sarah's attempts to communicate with her. Lisa had been through a traumatic ordeal that would leave psychological scars long after her physical injuries healed. But she was alive, and that was what mattered most. Sarah helped Lisa to her feet and began moving toward what she hoped was an exit that wouldn't lead them directly into the arriving backup officers. She had no way of knowing how many of the responding officers were part of Morrison's conspiracy and how many were honest cops who would help them escape. The safest assumption was that anyone wearing a police uniform was a potential enemy until proven otherwise. As they made their way through the building, Sarah could hear Sarah Chun and Lisa Park stood at the edge of the loading dock, staring down at the black water of the harbor as flashlight beams swept closer to their position. The corrupted officers were methodically searching the building, and Sarah could hear radio chatter coordinating efforts to seal off all possible escape routes. Within minutes, they would reach the loading dock and discover their quarry trapped between armed enemies and the cold depths of the harbor. Lisa gripped Sarah's arm with trembling fingers, her voice barely a whisper as she confessed her terror of deep water. The young woman had been through enough trauma for one night, and asking her to plunge into the harbor in total darkness seemed like another form of cruelty. But Sarah could see no alternative that didn't end with both of them dead or disappeared like Jennifer, Maria, and Amanda before them. The sound of voices grew louder as the search team approached their section of the building. Sarah recognized Detective Hart's partner, Officer Mike Stevens, calling out coordinates and search patterns to the other corrupt cops. Stevens had always seemed like an honest officer during their brief interactions at the precinct. But tonight he was working with the same men who had murdered innocent women to protect their criminal enterprise. Sarah made a split-second decision based on her military training and her knowledge of the harbor's geography. Instead of jumping directly into the open water where patrol boats could easily spot them, she led Lisa along the concrete dock toward a series of support pillars that extended down into the water. The pillars were covered with years of marine growth and debris, providing both handholds and concealment for anyone desperate enough to use them. As they reached the edge of the dock, Sarah could see that the water level was about 15 feet below them. The tide was coming in, which would help mask the sound of their entry, but would also create stronger currents that could pull them away from the shoreline. Sarah explained to Lisa that they would need to lower themselves down the support pillars rather than jumping, both to minimize noise and to avoid injury in the dark water. The marine growth on the pillars was slimy and sharp, cutting into their hands as they began their descent toward the water. Sarah went first, testing each handhold carefully before committing her full weight to it. Lisa followed close behind, her fear of the water overcome by her greater fear of the armed men searching for them above. Just as Lisa's feet touched the harbor water, a shout echoed from the loading dock above them. Officer Stevens had reached their escape point and was sweeping his flashlight beam across the water's surface. Sarah pulled Lisa tight against the support pillar and held her breath as the light passed just inches from their heads, reflecting off the gentle waves, but somehow missing their partially submerged forms. Stevens called out to his fellow officers that the loading dock appeared clear, but he was positioning himself to maintain observation of the water approach. Sarah realized they were trapped in their current position, unable to move away from the pillar without being spotted, but unable to stay where they were indefinitely. The cold harbor water was already numbing their legs, and Lisa was beginning to shiver uncontrollably. Sarah's military training had included survival swimming and underwater navigation, but she had never attempted anything like what they were about to do. She whispered to Lisa that they would need to submerge completely and swim underwater toward the opposite side of the harbor, using the support pillars of other docks to navigate and surface for air when possible. Lisa's eyes went wide with terror at the suggestion, but she nodded her understanding when Sarah explained that it was their only chance of avoiding the patrol boats that were now sweeping the harbor with searchlights. The corrupt officers had called in maritime support, and the water was quickly becoming as dangerous as the land they had left behind. Taking the deepest breath of her life, Sarah Chun disappeared beneath the surface of the harbor with Lisa Park clinging to her arm. The water was shockingly cold and darker than anything either woman had ever experienced. Sarah's lungs burned almost immediately as she fought against the natural buoyancy of her body and the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thought. The underwater world of the harbor was an alien environment filled with debris, marine life, and currents that seemed to pull them in every direction except the one they wanted to go. Sarah used her hands to feel along the muddy bottom, following what she hoped was a straight line toward the commercial docks on the far side of the harbor. Lisa's grip on Sarah's arm was becoming desperate, and Sarah could feel the young woman's body convulsing as she fought against her natural instinct to surface and breathe. They had been underwater for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute, and both women were approaching the limits of their oxygen reserves. Sarah's lungs felt like they were on fire, and her vision was beginning to narrow as her brain screamed for oxygen. She had pushed her body to extreme limits during military training, but this was beyond anything she had ever experienced. The water pressure seemed to be crushing her chest, and every instinct told her to surface immediately before she lost consciousness. But something extraordinary happened as Sarah's rational mind began to shut down from oxygen deprivation. Her military training took over at a level deeper than conscious thought, and she found herself moving through the water with purpose and efficiency that surprised her. Her body seemed to know how to conserve oxygen and navigate in total darkness, as if her marine training had prepared her for exactly this situation. Lisa was struggling more severely, her movements becoming erratic as panic overwhelmed her survival instincts. Sarah wrapped her arm around Lisa's waist and began pulling her through the water with powerful kicks that propelled them both forward through the murky depths. She had no idea how far they had traveled or whether they were moving in the right direction, but stopping wasn't an option. When Sarah's exploring hands suddenly encountered the concrete foundation of another dock, she nearly cried out underwater with relief. They had crossed at least part of the harbor and found another place where they might be able to surface safely. Sarah guided Lisa upward along the concrete structure, praying that they would find air before either of them lost consciousness. They broke the surface in a narrow gap between two docked boats, gasping for air with desperate, ragged breaths that echoed off the water around them. Lisa was barely conscious, her lips blue from cold and oxygen deprivation, but she was alive and breathing. Sarah held her close while they both recovered from their underwater ordeal, listening for sounds that would indicate whether they had been spotted. The patrol boats were still sweeping the harbor, but they seemed to be concentrating their search closer to the fish processing plant where the gunfight had occurred. Sarah could see their spotlights creating patterns on the water hundreds of yards away, giving her hope that she and Lisa had managed to escape the immediate search area. But their situation was still desperate. They were soaked, freezing, and hiding in a commercial marina where they could be discovered at any moment. Lisa was showing early signs of hypothermia, and Sarah knew they needed to get out of the water and find shelter before exposure killed them both. The corrupt officers would expand their search area systematically, and it was only a matter of time before patrol boats reached their current hiding place. Sarah studied their surroundings and realized they were in the marina section of the harbor, surrounded by pleasure boats and small commercial vessels. Most of the boats appeared unoccupied at this time of night, but finding one they could access without setting off alarms or alerting security would be challenging. As they moved quietly through the water between the docked boats, Sarah spotted a small fishing vessel that appeared older and less sophisticated than the others around it. The boat had a simple cabin structure and looked like it might belong to someone who used it for subsistence fishing rather than recreation. More importantly, it didn't appear to have any obvious security systems or alarms. Sarah helped Lisa climb aboard the fishing boat, both women moving as quietly as possible to avoid detection. The deck was cluttered with nets, tackle boxes, and equipment that provided some concealment from anyone observing from the dock or neighboring boats. Sarah found an unlocked hatch that led into the small cabin, and they descended into the cramped but dry interior. The cabin smelled of fish, diesel fuel, and old rope, but it was warm and hidden from view. Sarah found some old blankets and helped Lisa get out of her wet clothes while she tried to assess their next moves. They were alive and temporarily safe, but they were also fugitives in a city where the police couldn't be trusted and the corruption extended to unknown levels of government. As Lisa warmed up and regained some strength, she began to tell Sarah about everything she had overheard during her captivity. The criminal enterprise was much larger than Sarah had realized, involving not just corrupt cops but also judges, prosecutors, and city officials. The missing women had been killed not just to silence them, but to protect a network that generated millions of dollars through human trafficking, drug distribution, and protection rackets. Sarah realized that Captain Morrison's death wouldn't end the conspiracy. It would only make the surviving participants more desperate to cover their tracks. Lisa was now the only living witness to their operations, and they would mobilize every resource to find and eliminate her before she could testify about what she had seen and heard. As dawn began to break over the harbor, Sarah made contact with the one person she thought she could trust, her former Marine Corps commander, Colonel James Mitchell, who now worked with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. Using the boat's marine radio, Sarah transmitted a coded message that identified her and requested immediate federal protection for herself and a witness. Colonel Mitchell's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, federal agents surrounded the marina and took both women into protective custody. The investigation that followed exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of city government and resulted in dozens of arrests and convictions. Lisa Park's testimony proved crucial in dismantling the criminal enterprise that had claimed the lives of Jennifer Walsh, Maria Santos, and Amanda Torres. The three young women were remembered not as victims, but as heroes who had risked everything to expose corruption and protect others from the same fate. Sarah Chun received commendations for her actions, but she left the police force soon after the trials concluded. She couldn't continue working in a system that had been so thoroughly corrupted, even after the guilty parties had been removed. Instead, she used her experience to work with federal task forces investigating police corruption in other cities. The abandoned fish processing plant was demolished and replaced with a memorial garden honoring victims of police corruption. The names of Jennifer Walsh, Maria Santos, Amanda Torres, and dozens of other victims were engraved on a simple stone monument that overlooked the harbor where Sarah and Lisa had almost lost their lives. Years later, when people asked Sarah how she had managed to survive underwater for so long during their escape, she would smile and give the same answer every time. Marines are taught to adapt, overcome, and survive in any environment. When justice is at stake and innocent lives hang in the balance, Marines can do things that seem impossible to everyone else. The truth is that courage doesn't make you superhuman, but it can make you do superhuman things when the cause is right and the stakes are high enough. Sarah Chun had learned that lesson in the muddy harbor water where she and Lisa Park found the strength to breathe underwater long enough to surface into the light of justice. The ocean had tried to keep their secrets, but some truths are too powerful to stay buried beneath the waves. Sarah Chun had proven that Marines never leave anyone behind, even when the battlefield is an underwater war zone and the enemy wears the same uniform you once trusted with your life. In the end, corruption had been exposed, justice had been served, and two women had survived to tell their story. Sometimes, that's all the victory anyone can ask for, and sometimes, it's enough to change everything. Radio chatter and vehicle doors slamming as the backup units positioned themselves around the facility. Flashlight beams began sweeping through windows and doorways as the officers prepared to enter and secure the scene. Sarah realized that she and Lisa were about to be trapped inside the building with no way to distinguish friend from foe among the responding officers. The loading dock where she had originally observed Sullivan and Hart was still the best option for escape, but it would require crossing open ground where they could be easily spotted by anyone watching the perimeter. Sarah explained the situation to Lisa as clearly as possible, making sure the traumatized young woman understood that their survival depended on reaching the harbor without being captured by the corrupt officers who were surrounding them. Lisa's response surprised Sarah with its clarity and determination. Despite everything she had been through, the young woman was thinking clearly and ready to do whatever was necessary to escape. She had heard enough of her captor's conversations to understand that being taken alive by Morrison's accomplices would be a fate worse than death. They reached the loading dock just as the first officers entered the main building. Sarah could see at least 3 patrol cars positioned around the facility, with more arriving every few minutes as word spread about the shots fired at Morrison's location. The harbor was only 100 yards away, but Crossing that open ground would leave them exposed to anyone watching from the building or the surrounding area. Sarah made a decision that shocked both Lisa and herself. She told Lisa that they were going into the water, that their only chance of escape was to swim out into the harbor and try to reach safety somewhere along the shoreline. Lisa protested that she wasn't a strong swimmer, but Sarah explained that staying on land meant certain capture or death. As they prepared to enter the water, Sarah heard the sound that chilled her to the bone. Heavy footsteps were approaching their position, and she could see flashlight beams getting closer to the loading dock. Morrison's accomplices had found their escape route and were moving to cut off their retreat to the water. Sarah looked at Lisa and saw her own determination reflected in the young woman's eyes. They had come too far and risked too much to be captured now. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as survivors who had refused to be broken by corruption and violence. The dark water of the harbor stretched out before them like a promise of freedom, but Sarah could see the lights of patrol boats beginning to sweep the area as the corrupt officers extended their search to the waterfront. Their escape was going to require more than just courage and determination. It was going to require a miracle. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Sarah Chun prepared to find out whether Marines really could breathe underwater when survival depended on it. As she maneuvered for a better position, Sarah caught a glimpse of Lisa still tied behind the overturned table. The young woman was pressed against the floor, trying to make herself as small a target as possible while the gunfire erupted around her. Her eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, and Sarah saw both terror and determination in that brief contact. The sight of Lisa's courage in the face of impossible odds reminded Sarah why she was risking everything for someone she had never met. This wasn't just about stopping corruption or solving missing persons cases. This was about the fundamental principle that innocent people deserve protection from those who would exploit and harm them. Lisa represented every victim who had been failed by a system that was supposed to keep them safe. Sarah's determination hardened into something beyond mere professional duty. This had become personal in a way that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. She was going to get Lisa out of that building alive, no matter what it cost her personally. Some missions were worth dying for, and some principles were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The remaining suspects were running low on ammunition and options. Morrison was trying to organize a coordinated rush on Sarah's position, but his men were too rattled and disorganized to execute complex tactics effectively. Their training as police officers had not prepared them for sustained combat against a determined enemy with superior tactical skills. Sarah heard Morrison give the order for the final assault, and she prepared to make her stand. 3 armed men were about to charge her position with everything they had left, and her survival would depend on speed, accuracy, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any academy. As she checked her ammunition and prepared for the final confrontation, Sarah Chun felt the familiar calm that came with accepting the possibility of death in service of something greater than herself. The battle for Lisa Park's life was reaching its climax, and Sarah intended to end it on her terms. But it was what she saw in the corner of the room that made her heart race with fury and determination. A young woman who matched Lisa Park's description was sitting in a chair, her hands bound behind her back and duct tape over her mouth. Lisa was alive, but clearly terrified, and Sarah could see bruises on her face that suggested she had been roughed up during her captivity. Sarah realized she was looking at more than just a corruption ring. These men were involved in human trafficking, drug distribution, and probably murder. The missing women hadn't just been silenced. They had been disappeared entirely to protect a criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars for corrupt cops and their criminal partners. As she watched, one of the civilian criminals approached Lisa and said something that made her struggle against her bonds. The man laughed and turned back to the table, where the conversation continued about routes, schedules, and payments. Sarah understood that she was witnessing the planning stages of Lisa's transportation to somewhere she would never be found. The odds were impossible. Sarah was outnumbered at least 6-1 in unfamiliar territory, with no backup and no way to call for help without alerting the conspirators to her presence. Every tactical consideration argued for retreat, regrouping, and finding another way to approach the situation. But, as Sarah watched Lisa struggle against her bonds, she thought about Jennifer Walsh, who had just wanted to work without being harassed. She thought about Maria Santos, who had tried to report inappropriate conduct by a police officer. She thought about Amanda Torres, who had been brave enough to gather evidence against corruption. All of them had trusted the system to protect them, and all of them had been betrayed by that trust. Sarah made a decision that went against every aspect of her training, but aligned perfectly with every value she held dear. She was going to get Lisa out of that room, even if it meant taking on impossible odds. She had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan by being smart, being brave, and never leaving anyone behind. Tonight, those same principles would guide her through the most dangerous mission of her life. The rescue attempt would either save Lisa Park's life or get them both killed. But Sarah had learned long ago that some things were worth dying for, and justice was at the top of that list. As she prepared to take on a room full of armed criminals and corrupt cops, Sarah Chun felt the same calm determination that had carried her through every firefight in her military career. The battle for Lisa's life was about to begin, and Sarah intended to win it. She also began varying her routines, taking different routes to and from work, checking her car for tracking devices, and paying closer attention to whether she was being followed. The paranoia felt both foreign and familiar, like wearing an old uniform that had been stored away, but still fit perfectly. Sarah knew she was crossing a line that there might be no coming back from. Once she committed fully to this investigation, she would be placing herself in opposition to powerful forces within her own department. They would view her as a threat to be eliminated rather than a colleague to be protected. But, as she looked at the photographs of 3 young women whose only crime had been standing up for themselves, Sarah knew she had no choice. She had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath didn't come with an expiration date or a list of exceptions. Some battles chose you, whether you wanted to fight them or not. The next morning, Sarah walked into the police station with the grim determination of a soldier heading into combat. She didn't know who she could trust, didn't know how deep the corruption went, and didn't know if she would survive what she was about to uncover. But she knew that 3 women deserved justice, and she was possibly the only person in a position to get it for them. The investigation was about to become personal, and Sarah Chun had never lost a fight that mattered.